Some men commit their worst crimes at the beginning of the war. Some commit them in the middle. Max Simon waited until the very end, when Germany was already losing, when everyone with eyes could see that the Reich was finished, when rational men were thinking about survival and escape. Max Simon was still ordering massacres, still killing civilians, still running his division like a death squad with tank support. He was sentenced to death for what he did, and then he walked free. And then he lived to the age of 72 and died quietly in a German city in 1961. This is the story of Max Simon, a Waffen-SS general who murdered hundreds of innocent people across 2 countries and paid almost no price for any of it. Max Simon was born on January 6, 1919 in Breslau, which is today the Polish city of Roßlau. He grew up in a Germany that was still the Kaiser's empire, a rigid hierarchical society built around military values, national pride, and an absolute belief in German superiority. He was 15 years old when the First World War began in 1914, too young to fight at the start. But by 1917 he was old enough, and he served as an infantry soldier in the final brutal years of the conflict. He came home in 1918 to a defeated Germany. Like so many men of his generation, the experience of defeat and humiliation left a mark that never healed. He joined the Reichswehr, the small professional army permitted to Germany under the Versailles Treaty, and spent the 1920s as a career soldier. He was not a political activist in the early years. He was a professional military man doing his job in a diminished army in a diminished country. But when the Nazi movement rose to power and began rebuilding German military strength, Simon saw his opportunity. He joined the SS in 1933 and transferred to the SS Verfügungstruppe, the armed military formation that would eventually become the Waffen-SS. He was 34 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in uniform, and now he was in the organization that was going to restore German greatness by any means necessary. He rose steadily through the SS ranks throughout the 1930s. He was a competent professional soldier who understood tactics, logistics, and the mechanics of commanding men in the field. He was not a dramatic figure. He was not charismatic or theatrical. He was methodical, demanding, and completely committed to the mission of whatever organization he served. In the 1930s, that organization was the SS, and the SS demanded absolute loyalty, absolute obedience, and absolute commitment to the ideology of National Socialism. Simon provided all 3 without visible hesitation. He served in the early campaigns of the war, Poland in 1939, France in 1940. He was part of the Totenkopf Division, one of the most notorious SS divisions in the entire war, a division that had been formed originally from the guards of the concentration camp system. The men of the Totenkopf Division had been selected for their willingness to carry out the most brutal aspects of SS ideology. They were not ordinary soldiers who happened to wear SS uniforms. They were ideological warriors who understood from the beginning that their war was a war of racial extermination as much as a conventional military campaign. In May 1940 in France, the Totenkopf Division committed one of the earliest documented SS massacres of the Western Campaign. At the town of Les Paradis in northern France, soldiers of the Totenkopf Division captured approximately 100 British soldiers from the Royal Norfolk Regiment. The British soldiers were prisoners of war, disarmed, entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. They were marched to a barn wall and machine-gunned. 97 men were murdered. 2 survived by hiding under the bodies of their comrades. Simon was a senior officer in the Totenkopf Division at this time. He was operating in the same environment where this massacre occurred. The culture of the division that produced Les Paradis was the culture Simon lived and served within. Then came the Eastern Front.
Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, and the Totenkopf Division was part of the massive German drive into the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front was unlike anything that had come before. It was, from the very first days, a war of extermination. The orders given to German forces made clear that this was not a conventional military campaign subject to the laws of war. Commissars were to be shot on capture. Jewish civilians were to be handed over to the Einsatzgruppen.
Partisan activity was to be met with collective reprisals against civilian populations. Villages suspected of supporting partisans were to be burned and their inhabitants killed. Simon commanded his regiment through some of the most brutal fighting of the entire Eastern Front campaign. The Totenkopf Division suffered catastrophic casualties in the fighting around the Demyansk Pocket in 1942, where it was encircled by Soviet forces for months. The division held its position through the winter in conditions of extreme privation and violence. Simon's performance in this desperate defensive fighting earned him recognition from his superiors and continued his rise through the SS command structure. But military performance and war crimes were never separate categories on the Eastern Front. They happened simultaneously in the same units, in the same operational areas. The Totenkopf Division's record of atrocity against Soviet civilians and prisoners of war was extensive and documented. Villages burned, prisoners shot, civilians murdered in reprisal operations. Simon commanded within this system. He was not a passive observer.
It was a senior officer in an organization that committed these acts as a matter of policy and practice. By 1943, Simon had risen to command a Totenkopf division itself. He led it through the massive battles of the Eastern Front in 1943 and 1944, including the fighting around Kharkov and the long defensive battles as German forces were pushed back toward the borders of the Reich. He was decorated multiple times. He received the Knight's Cross and its higher grades. He was regarded within the SS as one of the more capable divisional commanders of the Waffen-SS, and then in the summer of 1944 he was given command of the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division Reichsführer-SS. This division was operating in Italy, and it was in Italy that Max Simon committed the crimes for which he would eventually be tried and condemned. Italy in 1944 was a nightmare for German occupying forces. The Allied armies were driving slowly northward up the Italian peninsula. The Italian resistance, the partisan movement, was active and growing in the German rear areas. German reprisal policy against partisans was savage and systematic.
For every German soldier killed by partisans, the occupation authorities demanded the execution of civilian hostages. The ratio varied, but was always brutally disproportionate. 10 civilians, 50 civilians, sometimes more for every German killed. This was official policy, and units like Simone's division implemented it with enthusiasm. In September and October 1944, soldiers of the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division committed a series of massacres in the Apennine mountain region of northern Italy that remain among the most documented and most horrifying war crimes committed by German forces on the Western Front. The massacre at Marzabotto was the worst. The village of Marzabotto and the surrounding communities of Grizzana and Monzuno sit in the Apennine Mountains south of Bologna. In late September and early October 1944, SS soldiers from Simone's division moved through these villages in an operation officially described as an anti-partisan sweep. What actually happened was the systematic murder of the civilian population. SS soldiers went house to house. They pulled people out of their homes. They pulled people out of the local church where many had taken refuge, believing that a house of God would protect them. They shot men, women, children, and elderly people. They threw grenades into cellars where families were hiding. A priest was murdered at the altar of his church. Babies were killed. Pregnant women were killed. The very old and the very sick who could not flee were killed where they lay. By the time the SS soldiers finished their work, approximately 770 civilians had been murdered in Marzabotto and the surrounding area.
It was the single largest massacre of civilians committed by German forces in Western Europe during the entire war. Simon commanded the division that carried out this massacre. The orders for the operation came through his chain of command. The men who pulled the triggers wore his division's insignia. The reprisal policy that justified the operation in the language of military necessity was the policy his division implemented. He bore command responsibility for what happened at Marzabotto in the most direct and unambiguous sense. But Simon was not finished.
In April 1945, with Germany on the verge of total collapse, with Allied forces driving through northern Italy and across Germany itself, with the war clearly lost beyond any possibility of doubt, Simon's forces committed another massacre, this time in Czechoslovakia. In the village of Frog, also known by its Czech name, SS soldiers under Simon's command murdered civilians in yet another reprisal operation. It was April 1945. Hitler would be dead within weeks. Germany would surrender within a month, and Max Simon was still ordering the murder of civilians. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Simon was captured by Allied forces. He was tried by a British military tribunal in 1947. The charges against him included his command responsibility for the Marzabotto massacre and other war crimes committed by his division in Italy. The evidence was overwhelming. The survivors of Marzabotto testified. The documents were examined. The chain of command was established. On May 24, 1947, Max Simon was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death. And then something happened that happened far too often in the post-war years. The sentence was not carried out.
The death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and life imprisonment did not mean life. Simon was released from prison in 1954. He had served 7 years. 7 years for the murder of approximately 770 civilians at Marzabotto alone, plus the additional victims of his division's operations across Italy and Czechoslovakia. 7 years. And then he went home. He returned to West Germany. He lived in Lenggries in Bavaria. He lived there quietly for the rest of his life. He died on February 1, 1961. He was 62 years old. The survivors of Marzabotto were still alive. The families of the 770 people murdered in those mountain villages were still alive. And the man responsible for ordering their deaths had served 7 years in prison and spent his final years as a free man in Bavaria. The Italian government repeatedly requested that Simon be extradited to face justice in Italy. The West German government refused. The legal and political complexities of post-war Germany, the Cold War priorities that pushed the Western powers toward rebuilding West Germany as an ally rather than prosecuting its war criminals, the institutional resistance within West German society to confronting the crimes of the recent past, all of these factors combined to protect Max Simon from the justice that his victims deserved. Marzabotto has never forgotten. The village maintains a memorial to the 770 people murdered there in September and October 1944. Every year, ceremonies are held to remember the dead. The names of the victims are recorded. The story is taught to Italian schoolchildren. The massacre is recognized as one of the defining atrocities of the German occupation of Italy, and the name of the man who commanded the division that carried it out, Max Simon, is part of that record forever. Here is what we need to take from Max Simon's story. He was not an aberration. He was not a rogue commander who went beyond his orders in a moment of madness. He was a product of the SS system.
A man who had been trained and selected and promoted within an organization that regarded the murder of civilians as an acceptable and sometimes necessary tool of military policy. The massacre at Marzabotto was not the action of soldiers who had lost control. It was a systematic, organized, methodical operation carried out over multiple days by soldiers following orders in a chain of command that led to Max Simon. And then he was released after 7 years and lived freely for another 7 years and died in his bed, while the families of 770 murdered civilians in the Apennine Mountains lived with what had been done to them for the rest of their lives. That is the complete story of Max Simon, the crimes and the impunity together. Both of them matter. Both of them need to be remembered, because remembering both is the only honest way to honor the people he murdered.